Welcome back, everyone. Now we will be beginning with the special panel 1. The theme of this panel is State of the Field, Accessing the Discourses in Chinese Studies. I request all the speakers to please take the seats. So this session will be chaired by Professor Alka Acharya, an Honorary Director of Institute of Chinese Studies, Professor and Chair of the Center of East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And the speakers are Dr. Bhim B. Subba, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad, Telangana, Adjunct Fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Professor G. Venkat, Raman, Professor, Institute of Management, Indian Institute of Management, Indore, Honorary Fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Anushka Saxena, Staff Research Analyst, the Takshashila Institution, Bengaluru. And finally, we have Shagufta Yasmin, Doctoral Scholar, Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Now I hand over the stage to Chair. Thank you.
Welcome to the first session of the 17th AICCS. And this session is dedicated to that endangered species in the university system today, the one who reads books. This is a declining number, and unfortunately, we as teachers in universities ourselves, Venkat is here, Bhim is here, will vouch for the fact that very few people have time to read books from cover to cover. And more importantly, not just read books, but understand, contextualize, historicize, problematize, and then fit it into your research scheme. And that's one reason why the AICCS has this component as one of the sessions in all its conferences, which is inviting research scholars who have done precisely that, gone into depth, handled books as opposed to the vast quantities of information that is now accessible like that on the internet. Much of it is extremely kind of research academic work, and actually understand what books mean to research. All these people are in various stages of their research and teaching, and what they're going to do very briefly is take you through that particular field on which they have done some in-depth look at, researched. This is not a book review kind of a session. This is a session in which all these scholars are going to give you an idea about the debates, the discussions, the issues that are dominating that particular field. And then to tell you why these issues are dominating, contextualizing them. In what manner are they dominating? Problematize them. And therefore, how do you then start to grasp the essence of these issues with reference to your research? So this is dedicated to both those who deal with books, who like books, who read books, and those who we want to inspire to read books. Books are the very core of research. So with that, introductions have already been made, 10 to 12 minutes. At roughly 10 minutes, I'll just do this gentle knock. We won't have a Q&A so that we spend more time in giving these people some more time for their presentations. What you all are welcome to is, after this session, go up to the people whose field of interest coincides with yours and have a discussion with them. So I will request Venkat to open the session.
Good morning, everyone, again. As we mentioned that the special theme of 17th AICCS is Understanding China in a Turbulent World, Geopolitical Contestation and Cooperation. So what I have, done is, because many of the things developments that you're witnessing today are related to trade wars, overcapacity, Chinese economic overcapacity, and a certain kind of a contestation which is more based on state capitalism versus market capitalism, what people are calling Beijing consensus versus Washington consensus. So I have tried to, look at some of the books which, dwell with these themes. Now, what I've done is I've just put the front cover of all the 5 books that I'm covering. So let me, quickly get to Nicholas Lady, very well-known, sinologist, scholar on Chinese economy. So what is the overwhelming theme of Nicholas Lady's book, The State Strikes Back, is, he talks about the state capitalism as it is building in China. And some of the fundamental submissions that he has is, given China's, Xi Jinping's overwhelming focus on state capitalism, perhaps in the medium to long term, it is not going to work in favor of China and is going to do, damage prospects of China when it comes to its economic modernization project. Nicholas Lady, in his work, questions certain conventional wisdom. For instance, current scholarship, most of them, they basically say that China doesn't have an SOE problem, that is state-owned enterprise problem, but it has a heavy industrial problem. Nicholas Lady contends that, that's not true. He says that China does have an SOE problem, and he has done deep study of private firms in China and SOEs in China, and has come to the conclusion that in similar domains of functioning, it is the Chinese state-owned enterprises who have been found severely wanting. In other words, private firms have done much better than SOEs. Another major, contestation which Lady engages in is, many people say that there are lots of social burdens that state-owned enterprises have to bear with, and so therefore their underperformance can be explained because of this particular factor, that is, social burdens. But Nicholas Lady again argues that since the 1990s, this part of the costs that have been incurred under the Tanway system for very long, that is something which is not of an equal measure today. And as a result of series of reforms, the state-owned enterprises are no more bearing those costs which many scholars believe that it is. So therefore, there has to be a deeper explanation why, despite all encouragement, state-owned enterprises are not able to perform as well as private firms. The most, one of the most significant conclusions which Lady comes up with is, he says that the US is likely to fail in its decoupling measures and all its endeavors to decouple from China and corner China in the name of trade wars and any other name. Why? Because the current engagement of China with European Union, Japan and other powers is of a significant proportion, and none of those countries are likely to come up with similar kind of decoupling measures that is going to hurt Chinese prospects in the near future. The next book is of Stephen Morgan. Stephen Morgan is a professor of Chinese economic history at the University of Nottingham. And in this particular book, he highlights the contradictions and challenges of China's state capitalism. Now you see this again, why again I am reiterating why I've chosen, this particular book is, this gives us an opportunity to further reflect on, the larger geopolitical game that is, being played in terms of the state capitalism versus market capitalism binary, broadly speaking. Of course, there are lots of, shades in there as well. So Nicholas Lady basically highlights how there are various contradictions and challenges in the operationalization of Chinese state capitalism. And he calls the hybrid of capitalism and socialism as it is being currently implemented in China. He calls this quote unquote raw capitalism. So he says that, he argues that from abandonment of planned economy, today we see this raw capitalism. He basically credits the Chinese system for pursuing what he calls quote unquote appropriate use of markets. How China has been very, very ingenious in combining the private sector and the state-owned enterprises, and the and then the way these state-owned enterprises and private firms operate, they not only compete with each other, but the way they go about competing with each other ultimately ends up in both influencing the functioning of each other. So he says that though many have been lifted out of poverty, the socio-economic inequalities still remain, and the benefits have not been, very uniform across the region. He combines, various factors in analyzing the Chinese economy. So, for example, he looks at Chinese economic history. He looks at, investment patterns. He looks at innovation. He looks at energy and investment, etc., etc. Now, contrasting to, Stephen Morgan's work on Chinese economy, we have another work which, unfortunately, I don't have the slide here. This is by a Chinese economist. He is a professor in Fudan University. His name is Lan Xiaohuan. Lan Xiaohuan actually wrote this book in Chinese, and the book's name is How China Works, an introduction to China's state-led economic development. Compared to Stephen Morgan's arguments, Lan Xiaohuan argues that we need not look at China's problems in terms of the failure of economic reforms or market reforms. And he is someone who strongly argues this whole economic overcapacity business. So as against Stephen Morgan's work, Lan Xiaohuan argues that China's market reforms have promoted economic growth, notwithstanding some of the shortcomings. And the Chinese government has governed the Chinese economy not only through policy guidance, but also through participation in the very process of urbanization and other industrialization measures. And he says that the Chinese government has been the party state has been very, very innovative in finding out how does it bridge economic theory and reality, keeping in view the Chinese conditions. And in fact, he goes on to defend and provides very interesting rationale for the Chinese overcapacity thing. So for example, he says that the overcapacity problems related to any economy is not something which is abnormal, because ultimately demand and supply forces tend to equilibrate in the medium to long term. Second, he has a very interesting take. He says that governments, investments by private firms and SOEs at various levels, they function in such a way that overcapacity is very much expected. Why? Because he says that time to time, there are certain, although the party state rules all over China, but the local leadership, every local leadership that is there, it has a certain kind of preferential policies, and every time there is a change in local leadership, these preferential policies are also likely to change. So therefore, firms, whether they are SOEs or they are private players, they are very much skeptical about these change in policies. So whenever the sun is shining, make hay. And that is the logic which compels many of these investments to go for overcapacity. Third, they say that overcapacity is again something overrated and overly criticized, because it is very difficult for firms to predict what holds for them in the future. And they say that as China's lower middle class and middle class aspires for a higher standard of living, there seems to be a mismatch between what they expect, how much demand will increase over a period of time. But nevertheless, to cater to these aspirations, these firms, the local Chinese firms, are engaging in this whole business of overcapacity. The most interesting part of his book is where he says that there are certain benefits of overcapacity. For instance, he says that how this overcapacity thing has played a critical role in converting the agricultural labor to industrial labor. And that is something which is at the core of industrialization in a developing economy. And the second is, he says that what the West calls copycat business is actually something that is not acceptable, because there is a tremendous amount of wrestling, that slugfest that all the firms are there, both small and the big. And in the process of this whole slugfest, what emerges is tendency to go for innovation in products and services, innovation in pricing, and ultimately the best man wins. And he says that medium to long term, the lesser, mortals tend to exit and the strong ones remain. But he says that finally it is some of the big players, who get hold of technology, who have access to technology, and they do much better. The last two books, Superpower Showdown by two Wall Street Journal, reporters, correspondents Bob Davis and Ling Wei, is again an excellent book. It talks about, it has a first-hand account of trade wars, and trade wars we know now is an inherent part of geopolitics. So he says that how the American businessmen initially have been had successfully lobbied with the successive administrations in their attempts to quote-unquote socialize China. But ever since the 2008 financial crisis, China has started flexing its muscles. They say that under Trump 1.0, the American policy towards China has been very incoherent, because the officials who negotiated with China tended to have different kinds of interests. So, for example, Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary, he was someone who was more keen on opening up financial markets, whereas a trade representative like Lighthizer, he was more interested in, talking about IPR and all that. So, their conclusion is there is little to be achieved by trade wars, and they also, infer that in the medium to long term, China would succumb, to various contradictions there are in its domestic economy, like the debt issue and other issues. However, they conclude by saying that China is going to be a considerable force to reckon with as far as military power is concerned. I'll stop here. Maybe in the Q&A, later during the lunch or during the break session, we can talk about another interesting book. It's an edited book by Ethel Solingen. It's titled Geopolitics, Supply Chains and International Relations in East Asia. It talks about how the disruption in global supply chains stem from US-China tensions and how it has led to significant impact when it comes to operationalization of global supply chains in East Asia. But they also talk about a larger spillover effect in Africa and other parts of the world. And that tension stems from the disruption in global supply chain. And that, again, basically, we know the root cause, that is the geopolitics of trade wars. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Venkat. It's easy to see where his heart was. He spent a lot of time telling us about the book by the Chinese scholar. And that really brings out another very important aspect about doing research on China, which is the critical importance of language training. And Bhim, who's going to come up next, who has devoted a considerable part of his research since his PhD on studying the party and party politics, would probably address something that Mr. Nalapat had mentioned, which is the opacity of the system. Maybe Bhim's explanations about the books he's read may make us understand that actually you need to dive deep and look at the language resources, then possibly the opacity is somewhat addressed. So, Bhim, yours.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Professor Venkat Raman has already laid down a path for me to really go on straight to what I have to really address the audience today. And as the chair, Professor Alka, has already said, that I'll be speaking on mostly what is domestic to foreign. And also because it's a part of my research that I'm doing it, and also teaching this course in my university there. So why it's important? So some of the themes that I'm going to touch is some leading from some of the books here. Yeah. So I won't quote Xi Jinping here, though, but I would quote this famous foreign minister of China. He is one of the first diplomat foreign minister. And we know, like today, Qin Gang, the last foreign minister who was being purged by the party, like him, Chechen was there. But he was one of the first person or the leader of China who really said that foreign policy is the extension of China's domestic sphere. Now that brings into a lot of IR discussions with regard to neoclassical realism also. But at the same time today, in fact, what Professor Venkat already said is about overcapacity or leaders' choices and all. So this brings into fore what the domestic spares of China is very important for China's foreign interactions here. So therefore, I tried to see into these 6 books, and 2 are by the chairman himself. And the governance of China, that is, it has already 4 volumes now. And the book below that, actually it is in Chinese here, but you also have an English version. It is Xi Jinping's Speeches on Diplomacy. 2 volumes have come. And I think this is the important work. Really, it goes and throws a light on how the party stayed under Xi Jinping since 2013 to 2021. All his speeches around the world is being documented there. And as I read through this, it definitely has a lot of story to tell. Whether it's a good story or other story, it is the reader's perception how to go about this. Likewise, the China's foreign, rising foreign ministry today. So this is the latest book that was published in 2024. I think it just came out in a couple of months ago. That is in, I think, April, if I'm not wrong. So this book is the arm, or that shows that how China's foreign ministry or its foreign policy has really invoked what the chairman's foreign, domestic ideas into conversion into foreign policy here. Likewise, you have China's, can you see that China's political worldview and Chinese exceptionalism? It has that ideas as well. And the political thought of Xi Jinping. So I am trying to show these books, or through these books, I'm going to tell you a story about how the domestic or the China's foreign relations actually goes from the domestic sphere. Yeah. So let us see, having read these books for my class and as well as for the session here, so I identify these 3 markers here. One is ideas, the other is institutions, and others personalities and policies. So to go briefly, in each slide, I would go with its 3 markers here. So with regard to ideas, today increasingly China talks of Chinese exceptionalism. However, when we have to read or parse Chinese exceptionalism, we should also be aware that we are not falling in the trap of what American exceptionalism is talking about. So it is rather the bundle of ideas which is based on Chinese creed or ideology. This morning, Professor Pala definitely talked about whether it's race or ethnicity that we are talking about, or also about how Chinese think about its power and influence here. So that is one of the ideas that we really see in Chinese foreign policy today. At the same time, if we have to see is, it also corroborates or looks into how Chinese exceptionalism is good, benign, and also different. Likewise, it locates China's institutional politics as the sense of exceptionalism within the Chinese Communist Party. Now, therefore, Chinese Communist Party is an important agency here. And now if you see whether Chinese Communist Party is still a revolutionary party today. So it is not. But when we see the discussions today increasingly, in the last few years, we see it is as ruling or governing party today. So therefore, the debate on is it still a revolutionary party, it's debatable here. To move further here, now institutions here. So in all these books, when we look at it, it actually dwells on many of these institutions that the party is talking about. Like it's the state and party organization reforms that took place 2018 onwards. You see many of the existing party institutions subsuming the state institutions, or in fact, this morning, devouring state institutions into party here. Likewise, the role of United Front Work Department. Now, the United Front Work Department is actually, is like India's equivalent of, the NRI, Bharat, Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the wing of the, the state. It is playing that important role today. Today, it is not only uniting the party workers with the non-party workers, but it is also connecting or uniting the Chinese, the native Chinese with Huachao or Huaren, like all Chinese or overseas Chinese or diaspora Chinese here. So also, you could see co-option of state and party institutions. Likewise, in the text, you also get to know the evolution of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, an important institution or a commission where the foreign ministry or the Politburo member is always, the boss there. And likewise, you could see the most important today institution that has come up is also China's International Development Cooperation Agency, that is on the lines of Overseas Development Agency of Japan. And to inform you, to the audience, it is the former Indian ambassador Liu Chaohui, who is the director of this institution. So anything China gives abroad, as an aid, as an economic aid or a loan, it's routed through this institution. So this is a new institution because this institution earlier was under the Ministry of Commerce, but today it is with the Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. So these are some of these institutional, restructuring that we see in China today, and also gives in how China is moving from domestic to foreign. Yeah. The last one now, the slides that I'm done. Now, as I mentioned, two of these important leaders were being purged within the party, but you could also see the change of purge that there happened within these two leaders there. Qin Gang and Li Shangfu, they were both prodigies of the president. Nonetheless, we could see the type of punishments these two leaders got is actually differentiated punishments also. So therefore, political loyalty is an important variable or a category there. And as we say also, the winner takes all strategy that is, if you see in Chinese politics. So these books definitely, throws a light on all these aspects. And one of the other aspects is the anti-corruption campaign and political education is also an important area. And the last one is international environment and aggressive foreign policy, what Professor Venkat already talked about. Before stopping my presentation, I would also mention to you that with regard to United Front Work Department, you could see the role of United Front Work Department. Today, increasingly, these agencies or these, the folks who are working or manning these agencies are today also ambassadors to different countries. Now, that is what we talk about, the percentages also, because in percentage you could see this aggressive foreign policy that we see is a lot of these folks who have been working in internal minority provinces are being trained there and are being appointed also as foreign, ambassadors to foreign countries and all. So you can see how these experiments or pilot projects that are being shaped in the domestic sphere, those experiences are being taken to to outside countries. In South Asia, if you couple of years ago, in Pakistan's Chinese ambassador to Pakistan and Bangladesh were all United Front Work officials who had served in minority provinces in Ningxia and Guangxi, and they later on actually were being promoted as ambassadors to these countries. So this shows that definitely they are being trained in those restive provinces and also being sent to foreign lands to be representatives of that. So I'll stop here, and definitely we can, thank you.
Thanks, Bhim. So you, very interesting combination of both China watching in terms of observing whatever is happening, but then also going beyond the just observation into the historical antecedents, into the patterns, into the specific different features that characterize the Chinese system, the Chinese way of thinking. I think a lot of these things come out in the way in which Bhim has tried to give you a sense of the domestic and the foreign. I mean, all countries have this link operating in different ways. What we need to understand is how the Chinese domestic compulsions are propelling some of the new faces of China externally, particularly what he pointed out, that the dominant theme is aggressiveness. Where is this coming from? But is it aggressive? What is the nature of this aggressive? So I think these readings show you a much more nuanced, much more multifaceted way in which we need to understand this. So thanks a lot, Bhim. And now we have Anushka, one of the bright rising stars from the Takshashila firmament. She's been writing a lot these days. I enjoy reading her work, because even though she's located in an institution which is geared largely to policy, she grounds herself in very, very substantial reading of books, and that's really the burden of my song, read books. So, Anushka.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Acharya, for that. Thank you to the esteemed dais for your remarks so far, and really looking forward to Shagufta ma'am's as well. I understand this is the session that's keeping you from lunch, so I'll try to make the best of my time here. Yes, I work at Takshashila. We pride ourselves on truly thinking independently, in that we're a tad bit distant from Delhi. So I think I'll try and see how I can bring in some of the fresh perspectives that we try to work on at Takshashila in my presentation today. And I'd like to talk about what I've distilled from accessing, as the suggestion suggests, discourses in Chinese studies, particularly in tech and innovation. And I'll have a short piece on defense innovation as well towards the end, because that's my comfort food. But let me first start by laying out the broad takeaways that I have for you from prevalent theories and frameworks on studying China's tech and innovation ecosystem. And if we go back to history, and we've had a lot of conversation today about how we have to learn the right lessons from history. During the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s, the US and the USSR, as you know, all of us know, were interlocked in contestation over innovation in the technological domain, particularly those that are critical to national security. Space, missiles, even semiconductor chips, the whole shebang, right? And a compelling explanation for why nations or great powers engage in contestation over innovation lies in an idea proposed by Mark Zachary Taylor in his book, The Politics of Innovation. Now, I don't have his credentials because, well, frankly, I didn't memorize them. But the idea that I'm talking about here is creative insecurity. So you have a sort of insecurity in nation states with great power ambitions from external military or economic threats, which become more pertinent than internal political divisions and drivers. So you, on the one, and this kind of forces on the one hand a country to innovate in a bid to reach a breakthrough solution that can grant it a disproportionate advantage in national security in the domain of contestation. But on the other hand, it kind of brings the revisionist status quoist power play back into the picture, right? So if we look at the USSR as a revisionist power and the US as a status quoist one, when this revisionist power makes enough progress to induce doubt or insecurity in one's leadership, the fear of the lack of creativity and innovation then creeps in. And essentially this fear relates to lack of innovation, lack of progress, lack of total factor productivity, something that we're seeing in China today as well. And the beauty of this is that it impacts not just the revisionist power in question, but also the status quoist power, which has been considered an established technological power for a long time. And so, and today, this morning, Professor Acharya talked about parallels. So what we're seeing today then is very similar to what perhaps the dynamics of creative insecurity played as during the Cold War years. I'm sure you've come across the critical technology tracker that's been prepared by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And they've ranked countries based on their leadership in 50-odd areas that include AI, quantum, machine learning, biotechnology, so on and so forth. And in the first iteration of the tracker, they made the claim that China is leading in 37 of about 44 areas in what we understand as critical and emerging technologies. Now, notwithstanding the shortcomings of the criteria for this classification, I think it is quite clear that China is indeed catching up to maybe US technology or US and allied technology in some of these fields. And you'll also remember the incident from last year when the Mate 60 Pro was launched by Huawei, and the belief was that the 7 nanometer chip used in that was developed by SMIC, which is a Chinese chip production giant. And the fear then that struck was that China now has the capability to produce advanced chips itself. And again, in just a few months, the verification of that report was busted when it was found that it was actually a stockpile of Taiwanese imported chips from the pre-sanction era or the pre-export control era that was then used to produce the Mate 60. Nonetheless, when developments like this come to the fore, it creates ripple effects. And despite the fact that the claims need to be verified, it reinforces the insecurity in the status quoist power, because there is then the belief that a revisionist power has progressed enough to induce a sense of anxiety. And so you have politics of innovation on your screen, and related to this idea of creative insecurity, then the next step, I think, is the shifting of the lens or the Overton window of policy decision making and policy thinking from economic logic first to strategy and security first. And then we see the two sides engage in stuff like export controls, and suddenly comparative advantage is not the pillar driving geopolitics and cooperation, but it's rather geoeconomics rooted in contestation. And so on the US front, we see stuff like export controls. On the Chinese front as well, we see President Xi Jinping make statements like, we have a stranglehold on our scientific and technological progress, and this stranglehold has been placed by the US and its allies, and there is a need for China to better safeguard its innovation ecosystem. It must open up, it must push for deeper integration of development and security, and then this idea of the interlinkage between development and security comes to dominate narratives and discourses in policy making. So in the broader context of China's increasingly hostile external environment, as I've just discussed, there is an excellent explanation that's provided in the book by David Edelstein, which is Over the Horizon. And here I'd like to showcase a framework that some of us have adapted from Edelstein's book at Takshashila. Now, this framework basically tries to draw 2x2 matrix of short and long-term horizons of two competing powers, and which horizon for which power determines whether they would compete or cooperate with the other power. So when a rising power has a long-term focus and a declining power has a short-term focus, let's say the rising power here is China and the declining power here is the US, the two end up cooperating, then contesting. because the rising power is still thinking long term and is in the game of extracting concessions and benefits from the international order, in which the status quo power has already played a major role so far. So from the framework, you can say that when the US, for example, had a short time horizon and China had a long one, all through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, conditions were conducive for cooperation. But by 2010, the PRC's time horizons changed. Its aggression towards its neighbors signaled that it now focused on consolidating its position in the short term. Meanwhile, the US was still focused on the short-term horizon, and then this is where you see a mix of skirmishes but pragmatic cooperation. Moving on to what the current scenario kind of looks like, and I'll conclude in 2 minutes. Moving on to what the current scenario kind of looks like, we are seeing that the PRC is continually arrogant against its neighbors. It has an ambition vis-a-vis the BRI, and its policy towards technological innovation has become like a blitzkrieg, right? So it wants to do everything all on its own without any allies, which where perhaps the strength that the US AI, quantum or semiconductor ecosystem has, China will lose, which is the strength of allies and the strength of a free environment for innovation. The Chinese ecosystem is also one that is authoritarian in nature, which prevents the creation of conducive conditions for deliverables to come out as they will naturally, right? Because there is a pressure to deliver. And so in combination with creative insecurity and the shifting of the Overton window away from economic logic to security and strategy, we see this is where the PRC's technological ecosystem is currently thriving. Just a final point about books you should look at when you think of military and defense innovation in China. Now, and this is where official Chinese documents play a really important role. So you must look at the Science of Military Strategy or the guiding doctrine on operations in the PLA to understand what the goals of these oft-heard terms such as theaterization or multi-domain integrated joint operations are. And at the crux of this is the hostility vis-a-vis the US, the creative insecurity to be left out in military domination, and of course the ability to create a force domestically that is technologically advanced and capable of winning high-intensity localized wars, which is why we see waves of demobilization to a tune of people to a number close to 300,000, but at the same time we see a focus on building technological military capabilities like a seamless battle-linked network, electromagnetic warfare, so on and so forth. And so I'd say, to conclude, that from the Indian perspective, and stuff like this is really well articulated in Paul Schar's 4 Battlegrounds and Thyming Chung's Innovate to Dominate. So I'd say from the Indian perspective, military innovation in China is more critical to assess and more realistic to compete with. I do hope some of our higher defense organization reforms, as well as our academic discourses going forward, reflect the realities of the threat landscape as is, and do a good job in distilling the right lessons from history and looking at frameworks such as creative insecurity, the idea of a techno-security state, the shifting of Overton windows with changes in external drivers, and the creation of stable pillars of technological growth. So thank you for that, and I'll be happy to take questions outside.
Thanks, Anushka. So here are all the joys of competitive, cooperative dynamics in an arena which is obviously going to be one of the most significant ones as we move ahead. Sloshing in the background were big concepts like catch-up strategies, modernization theories, and another word which Professor Palat, revisionism, revisionist powers, and used in a context which is entirely different. But this is eventually about the way in which different nations are located on the spectrum of development and scientific technological levels of achievement. And what Anushka has done has opened up the space for investigation into some of the critical areas which are going to be very important for India from a policy perspective as well. So here again, we see a nice mix of policy and academic investigations. Our final speaker is Shagufta. She is about to complete her PhD in another emerging area which is well, now you see it, now you don't kind of situation, the environment.
A very good morning, everyone. The world is getting turbulent, and it is getting more turbulent because of the climate change. And by now, I think all of us are aware that the impact of climate change is being felt by each and every individual on the planet. And we also know why China is important. If you don't, my presentation will let you know why China is important. Okay, so for my presentation, I will be referring to the 5 books here. One is Richard Smith's China's Engine for Environmental Collapse. The second book is Julia Tipton's The Politics of Human Vulnerability to Climate Change, Exploring Adaptation Lock-ins in China and United States. The third book is Olivia Gipner's Creating China's Climate Change Policy, Internal Competition and External Diplomacy. And the fourth book is written by a Chinese professor, Dr. Chang Haiping. He was actually my mentor at the Beijing University, and I take the liberty to read the book in Chinese language. Knowing the Chinese language, I think it makes more sense when you study China in the language itself. So I refer to the book written by him, which is Chuanqiu Qiho Trili, the Zhongguo Fang'an. In English, if you translate it, it comes to China's plan for global climate change governance. And the fifth book will be Chen Kang's Politics of Renewable Energy in China. So these are the 5 books. So, sorry. Okay. This slide shows actually this is a projection where we see China joining the club of the largest polluters in the world. In 2007, China overtook the United States and became the largest polluter. And it was criticized heavily by all the countries all over the globe. To its defense, China adopted terms like environmental colonialism to defend its rights to economic development. China blames the US and the Western economy for benefiting from boom in China's manufacturing sector, and it argued that the American consumers got access to cheap Chinese products and services, and the manufacturers could exploit the cheap labor market in China. Richard Smith's book highly criticizes this position of China taking advantage of the global economic institutions post-Cold War. It criticizes the long-standing position of China which criticizes the developed countries of using China as the factory of the world and benefiting from the products that are made in China. Contrary to the Chinese arguments, the author highlights that China has tremendously benefited from the massive industrialization. It has also used its authoritarian power to provide an ultra-cheap labor to which no other developing countries could match. As a result, the environment and natural resources have faced severe challenges ranging from air, water, and land pollution to biodiversity loss in China. Okay, so what went wrong? Like, in spite of the claims that China makes to be a responsible stakeholder on the issue of climate change, why policy making and implementation still faces challenges in China? Richard Smith's book argues that high domestic heterogeneity has characterized China's engagement with the international efforts to address climate change, with particular opposition from polluting industries and the local governments who are benefiting from those revenues. Now, this Olivia Gipner's book titled Creating China's Climate Change Policy, Internal Competition and External Diplomacy sheds light on the dynamic domestic bureaucratic interaction that characterizes climate change policy making in China. The domestic policy making is characterized by internal competition between different government agencies, ministries, and political factions like the National Development and Reform Commission known as NDRC, Ministry of Ecology and Environment, and the State Council. Furthermore, the domestic political structure of China where the power is centralized, the policy making and implementation usually have top to bottom approach. This challenges the efficient implementation of policies, especially when the local government and the state-owned enterprises see them as a hindrance to their economic development. As a result, China is facing a severe case of vulnerability. Now, Julia Tipken's book titled The Politics of Vulnerability to Climate Change, Exploring Adaptation Lock-ins in China and the United States, argues that the concept of vulnerability is understood as a product of cultural ecology and a source of political economy. This provides a better understanding of the vulnerable groups to the impacts of climate change. Tipken highlights that social dimensions of adaptation and vulnerability is slowly receiving more attention from policymakers, but with few exceptions, has not really been anchored to strategic response to climate change. It uses a qualitative method and focuses on the challenges faced by local governments in China, and it also takes the case of United States. And Tipken actually takes two case studies. One is Atlanta in the United States, and second, Tsinghua in China. In Atlanta, Tipken highlights that vulnerability is due to the racial and economic inequalities stemming from a history of racial segregation and economic disparity. And in Tsinghua, the vulnerability is due to urban-rural divide. Rural areas in China still lack adequate infrastructure and resources to cope with the climate change. Furthermore, she describes that hukou system or the household registration system limits the access of rural residents to education, healthcare, and other resources. The author's central argument is that addressing the difficulties of adaptation lock-ins related to society's vulnerability is deeply connected to social justice when formulating climate change adaptation policies. Tipken criticizes the domestic political structures in both China and the United States, limiting climate change adaptation. Both authoritarian environmentalism in China and the liberal democracy in the United States challenges the adaptation process. Due to the top-to-bottom approach of policy making and implementation of climate policies in China, there is no participation from the grassroots level. And here we see the vulnerability in China. The red part shows the more vulnerables, and the red part is mostly focused or placed on the western part of China. And we know that the West has the least representation at the government level as well. And the non-participation of the civil society is, again, one of the two dimensions of the concept of authoritarian environmentalism, which is suggested by Mark Beeson. The other dimension is the decrease in individual liberty, which includes surveillance, forceful relocation of nomads in the western regions of China in the name of ecological migration or green grabbing by the authorities. So, what plays the major role when China is formulating its climate change policy domestically and at the international climate change negotiations is the image projection. Olivia Gipner's book titled Creating China's Climate Change Policy, Internal Competition and External Diplomacy highlights that the economic growth and energy security is at the heart of China's development. However, the rising concern of pollution leading to social unrest have pushed climate policy at the forefront. Eventually, the Chinese government has strengthened its ecological regulation in recent years. Richard Smith's book again highlights that at the international level, the becoming of China as the world's largest producer of the greenhouse gases owing to the energy sector. The energy sector, as you can see, coal still contributes to the 61% of the energy sector in China. So it actually draws criticism because of the way China still focuses on coal as the major source of energy. And eventually China is focusing on its efforts to tackle pollution by focusing on green energy and tightening its environmental locations. And at the international level, it has also pledged to peak its emissions by 2030 and also go carbon neutral by 2060. Gipner argues that the European Union and the United States have taken the roles of agenda setters and reference points. for framing climate change policy in China, and the adoption of the externally inspired climate policy depends on the condition of empowerment and rules of the games. Now here we see that China also doesn't shy from getting inspiration or ideas from the Western concepts or the Western policy making. However, Shang Haiping's book highlights that the transformation of China's global governance architecture has gone through a major shift, and it shows that China has become an important participant, contributor and leader in the construction of ecological civilization, which is Shanghai Wenming. His book defines the concept of global climate governance as a response to climate change, and he also highlights that while adhering to the core of the common but differentiated responsibility, the principle of sustainable development, China advocates the concept of global ecological civilization and the concept of community of shared future, which is Ranlei Mingyun Kungtung Thi and Shanghai Wenming. Now these concepts actually show a major shift that China is trying to project, and China is trying to show that it has taken the driving seat. The initial and the founding narrative of Chinese foreign used to be on the century of humiliation or the subjugation at the hands of the Western power. However, the recent discourse on China's climate change diplomacy, particularly in the new era, highlights the emergence of China as the rule maker, its increased economic strength and its growing influence at the international institutions, and its proposing of alternative institutions allows China to do so. China has also played a major role in bringing the developing countries and to project itself as a defendant of the rights of the global South, and also calls for, China's call for establishment of ecological civilization and the community of shared future for mankind highlights China taking the leadership role. The current state of geopolitics and the weakening position of the United States, especially the adherence and then withdrawal from the Paris Agreement during Trump 1.0, actually gave China an opportunity to become or play its role as a leader. However, China's climate change diplomacy still carries on with some continuities, like the promotion of social economic development and defending its developmental rights and the rights of the global South with no international commitments at the heart. And China is using the mechanisms of the UNFCCC to further its economic growth and influence on geopolitics. Thank you.
All right, we are done with our, Shagufta is in the throes of completing her PhD. I think that was quite apparent. But I hope you got a sense of the shifting discourse that she was trying to focus on, shifting discourse about issues related to environment, governance, sustainability, and such like. So now we have actually done very well in terms of time. I had said that there would be no Q&A because, what do you do Q&A? But, I would like the audience to engage in the sense that, would there be any books that you have read recently which you would like to bring to the attention of everybody, and whether you think that there is something that can be added to the presentations. We have about 15 minutes to do some back and forth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abhinav Kumar from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I would like to share a recent book which is suggested by Alka ma'am, that is Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. And I could correlate the development which China is on the path of, whether it's state-owned enterprises or whether it's in terms of EV and the rare earth material, which is now in the hot topic internationally. So I would like to ask the panel, how do you see the development of these businesses, especially when during the Tang, China opened up. And before opening up, Tang and his, the panel or the government officials, he asked them to go to visit these foreign countries and learn from them. And Marxism is not just to be stay in poverty. So how do you see now in context of the EV market and how China is going to tackle the challenge which is proposed by the United States? Tang Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. Author,
It's not a recent book, but something that is I make mandatory reading for my class, Ezra Vogel's book on here. So, I mean, that's purely to make the students understand that many things that we are hearing about or reading or discussing today have antecedents way back when China starts to open up. So, Venkat, would you like to take that on?
I think, there's no, as far as I understand, there's not a pinpointed question, but if I understand, you correctly, you're saying what would China do given the challenges that China is facing in front of this whole tariff war. China has taken an unsurpassable lead when it comes to the renewable energy, business, and people who are following these developments, they say that, again, one of the things which occurs to me, and I shared it with my students in the class, the whole project of China entering into WTO started with this aim of quote-unquote socializing China. But 20 years down the line, Chinese, with their participation in the so-called rule-based liberal international economic order, have turned the whole game in such a way that it seems they have been successful in, socializing Americans in a certain way, whereby forget about, market capitalism. In many ways, the Americans are being compelled to, go for state interventions in an otherwise market-based system. So, for example, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Coming back to, something which I was referring to earlier, Americans are, and Europeans also believe that renewable energy should not become something like what the oil shock, was in the 1970s. So they don't want to, have any kind of vulnerabilities in the renewable energy sector. Given the unsurpassable lead that China has taken, the only way to stop the Chinese is through the tariffs and through Inflation Reduction Act and other kinds of measures. They are now very keen to build local supply chains which will cater to boosting the renewable energy segment there. Now, how is China going to respond to that? Still, I think we are in the very initial stages. One is not sure. One way to do that is perhaps, addressing, boosting its domestic demand, which has caused, this, tremendous spurt in aiming for the, external markets.
Thank you for the question. I will actually tackle the political one, because you said is Marxism over in China, if I imply, socialism. Yeah. So, if you invoke that book, and definitely when Tang Xiaoping became the paramount leader post 1978 onwards, you could see the 4 cardinal principles being enshrined in the party constitution. Now, that definitely has Marxism, Leninism, socialism, and leadership of the party. And therefore, even if you, now, one of the interpretation that we have is also, like, don't theorize it the way Western scholars theorize it. And in China, it's very instrumental sometimes. And also because that gives them agency to really move ahead. Now, once upon a time, in Tang Shopping, they talk about collective leadership. Now today, Xi Jinping has said we have collective leadership, but it is a mix and match of Liu Shaoqi's party institution vis-a-vis people's participation, which is the party central there. So therefore, if you say socialism is a welfare state, I don't think so, because the party doesn't talk about China as a welfare state. It definitely wants, if you see the pronouncements made by the Chinese leaders, and they say, people are lazy, don't lie flat, So you need to work. So therefore, we cannot assume that socialism is a rice bowl, iron rice bowl that we understood once upon a time. So it in fact really leads to working hard and, etc. I would say there comes really.
Just to quickly add to what Professor Venkat has already talked about when it comes to maybe China's dominance and lead in some renewable energy related sectors, such as maybe the production of EVs. We also know China is one of the biggest consumers of some of these, in addition to being the producers like solar PV cells or EVs, so on and so forth. But when this comes to the question of innovation, I don't particularly think that this is a case of a breakthrough innovation that perhaps other countries cannot deal with, in that there is no match to Chinese dominance in the production of EVs. Of course, they have a massive process innovation lead, which is precisely the reason why there is the use of tariffs to specifically ward off Chinese imports of electric vehicles. But I think in addition to export controls that restrict Chinese imports, there is also the introduction of the ideas of diversification or self-reliance, and what those do. And so the parallel on the second policy maneuver for the Inflation Reduction Act would then be the Chips and Science Act, because that came along with the IRA to then enable production of domestic production of critical and emerging technologies like solar PVs and EVs domestically in the US. So when you think of the world as two systems, and this is again another academic endeavor by some scholars of technology and innovation today, like Paul Charles, like Chris Miller, who talk about how the world is seeing itself divided into two large bins, where there is a China leading bin of technology and innovation, and there's one that's led by the US and its allies. The policy response, that is diversification, is easier for the US to approach and work with than it is for China. And I think that's where we should temper our expectations as to the question of, how will we ever beat this dominance?
I don't have any books to suggest. I hope you're not restricting me to that. No, I could ask questions. Yeah. From what Venkat said about the competition between the state and private sectors, the question that shot up straight away is, how will you compare it with the Indian experience? After all, we had for a long time talk about a public sector which will show the lead. This is one of Nehru's USPs, as it were, selling points all the time. And it would lead the private sector in some way. And we've always had the charge that the public sector later became a parasitic presence in the Indian economy, and the private sector was being hampered. So obviously there's a issue of competition between them. Has anybody researched the comparison between a possible competition between private and public sector in India and in China? Has the effort been made? Because these are the two largest experiments, I think, where public and private sectors exist and in competitions. And this is arising from what you said about the competition between the two. Or is it a point that nobody considers it worthwhile comparing India and China, although we are always comparing ourselves to China, but not our actual experiences in this way? We're always saying we should imitate China rather than compare the actual the experiences. But that's just one point. About overcapacity, I mean, this is, of course, the most ancient problem of the development of capitalism. In those days, we used to call it underconsumption, not overcapacity, but it is the same. And it was at the core of all socialist theories. And the source of, and according to socialist theories, it was a source of the repeated and regular capitalist crises of overproduction. There is always capacity. Now we have a Chinese economy that seems to be suffering from overcapacity, or so the charges come. And the kinds of explanations that Scholar made, which you recited, seem to be superficial in the extreme, from what I've understood. As if to say some local leaders make hay while the sun shines and they create something and so on. That seems to suggest that it leads to extreme instability, not out of productivity, but owing to a local leadership getting the best out of a system while it has the opportunity. That is a non-innovatory type of economy, and not engaging really in overproduction in the real sense, but leadership's just trying to make the best out of it. Seems to be more a case of corruption, or close to corruption, from the manner in which it is presented. But certainly not of dynamism in the economy. That's not what it suggests. I would like to hear your opinion about it. And especially when if they suggest that there's a large middle class or lower middle class, which is aspirational, and they hope that that will provide the market for overcapacity. This is exactly the problem about all capitalist economies. There is a large population which doesn't have the capacity to absorb that what is overproduced. And that is what leads to the crisis. And how have they theorized that problem here, in all, which comes from all of underconsumption theory? I didn't see that particular line of investigation in that particular book that you summarized to us. And if I might ask Bhim a question, again from his presentation about the books, about Chinese exceptionalism. Yes, Chinese love to say they're exceptional. But that is central to every nationalism in the world from the beginning of time. I mean, beginning of nationalist time, which is late 18th century. Every one of them claimed that they're exceptional. And there are long theories about exceptionalism of the United States, of Britain, of Germany, of Russia. There are entire investigations about it. There's a huge historiography about it. It is German exceptionalism that led to the 2 world wars. It is American exceptionalism that leads to the unique leadership position of America. It is British exceptionalism that leads to British constitutional development, despite having an empire and being the pioneer role. And of course, Russia is exceptional in every way you can think of. And China is now the exceptional case. And India, I'm sure, will be exceptional. Of course, what they're identifying is specific and unique features in each development situation, which is natural. And to a nationalist argument, that particular nation is exceptional. It cannot be otherwise. So does Chinese exceptionalism, is it a useful concept at all, is my point. I don't think it is. A bit of a red herring in some ways. And on the question of innovation, again to you, Bhim, and to you also, Anushka, about what you said. Innovation is, the problem of innovation, we are told that Chinese are highly innovative and so on. Yes, they may be or they may not. But we are assuming they're innovative so much because they are producing so much, and the rest of the world is importing all that they are producing. But again and again, the evidence that is being presented is the production there is due to investments there from series of foreign corporations, especially the American. And the Chinese are doing the job very well. of producing there and exporting it to the rest of the world. Now, is that innovation in particular? From the way it is presented, it doesn't seem to be innovation. And I might say that innovation, of course, there are certain areas that would be innovation, especially in military technology, I suppose. Now, this is where the comparison with the Soviet Union is so important. The Soviet Union was not innovative. That's why it collapsed. I mean, that's why the economy could not compete with the American. But it was innovative in two areas: space research and defense technology, and in certain aspects of medical technology. In certain niche areas, it is innovative. In very important areas of defense and space, yes, innovative. But not innovative in anything at all. And therefore, it could not participate in innovations that are taking place in the rest of the world. And it became so backward that it was unable to compete, and finally gave up the competition because it was forced into a series of competitions, which is how the Americans bring down the Soviet Union. So is China innovating at all, or doing a very good job of using what innovations that are taking place elsewhere? And that it is doing successfully. So, and one final point I'd like to make is the most innovative are the military leaders, because it's military leadership and war that leads to maximum innovation. So I think that is why America is the center of innovation in the world. It has been perpetually at war since the Second World War. Before that, who was the innovator in the world? Germany. And Germany was perpetually going to war. And before that, who? The British and the French. They were the innovators. So warfare actually creates innovation. That's when your imagination is let loose and finances come unlimitedly for innovation. And that's when you really innovate. The rest are not innovations. So warfare and innovation go together. China has not been to war at all, practically, since, I don't know when, since the Korean War. And therefore, is it capable of innovation? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. On that question of the genre of books that we all are reading, I just have a particular genre to flag off to all the audience and the speakers here. I read very recently the Hong Kong Diaries by Chris Patton, who was a civil servant, stationed in Hong Kong. We also read about his, particular brand of reforms that he had, envisioned for Hong Kong, and how it went awry in that entire, sequence of events where Hong Kong becomes a part of China in all good effects. So that's a recall and reflection on what went wrong through a series of diaries that he kept all through these years, these 2 decades that he was stationed in Hong Kong particularly. Now, compared to that, the earlier book, the previous book that I had read was, again, it was a traveler's account of Central Asian countries and their relations and their perceptions about China. And this one is by Raffaello Cantucci, who's an Italian researcher based in UK, but has been in China for many years, and also other Central Asian countries. So again, a very interesting, intriguing account of looking at China from a context which is not very particularly located inside, but still, it's not really the other's gaze either. And the third book, the book that I actually began reading in that genre at the earliest was Professor Romila Thapa's book on looking eastward, or gazing eastward, actually, of monks and revolutionaries. So again, that's a brilliant account of all of those years, of actually the 50s when she had visited China. And looking at cultural revolution as an Indian traveler as an Indian traveler going to China on a brief visit, but still having a lot to observe and then, recall, reminisce, and reflect upon. So I think the genre that we must include also, and it has really benefited us greatly, is this great gaze of an author, particularly locating it in a context of travel, diaries, recall, recollect, and then with the benefit of hindsight sometimes, because Professor Thapar actually mentions that, as a postscript. So yeah, that's
absolutely
all that
right.
I wanted to flag.
The challenge really is which sections, which areas do we bring into this ambit of state of the field. We generally try and link it with the theme of the conference. So there was one boy, yeah, that's it. And then there was another boy in front of him. So, you. So just those two, and we will.
Hello, I am Satyam, second year student of DGIR. So recently I have read one book called How China Escaped a Poverty Trap. Actually, Yuen Yang. So actually this book is a kind of a mirror for ourselves also. He actually describes mainly the three arguments. The primary education of China in 1950, the primary educated people of China was actually bigger than us. That's the peak of that Nehruvian time. The second is that decentralization of China. That was the main of the point of overcapacity also. And third is the use of land. How the local governments have used the land to mobilize the private capital also. The 3 points, it's a very interesting, but kind of what are the main pillars for the Chinese industrialization and what we haven't done till now. Thank you.
Two books I've read recently, and I think... Yes, sorry, forgotten business. I'm doing PhD in the department. So my name is Vineet, and my topic is on climate diplomacy, actually. Okay, so not related to the conference, but previously doing my master's, I read two books, and I think it would be, it's linked to the theme a bit. So the first one is India's China Challenge. That's by Anand Krishnan. He was a editor, he was a journalist in Beijing, and he's not there anymore, but so his book focused on how China views itself, the internal environment in China, and he recounts a situation in which there was flyers against the party leader Xi Jinping and his policies, and how quietly they handled all these affairs, and how the economic balances are seen in China. So I think that gives a fantastic insight to how people, and how, since he's a journalist, he had access to the people living there, talking to them, and how they view China. And I think they found really interesting that as long as the economy is prosperous, they do not have much grievances, especially in Beijing and in the urban areas. And the second one is, it's a bit of a dated book, but they've updated it recently. It's called The Party by Richard McGregor, another journalist. And he talks about how the party works, the inside of the party, the internal standings, the standing committees, the politburos and everything. So talked about the influence of the princelings and how many of them were purged during Mao's Cultural Revolution. So how that influenced his rise, and how she has sidelined many people like Bo Xilai during those times. So gives a very key understanding of how the politics inside the party works. And many of them are not what we see from outside. Like, we think it's ideology, but there's a lot of politicking, and how she basically came from a lower end to how he became like the topmost. So yeah, those two books I feel gives an insight into China and what he sees.
No, thanks. I think that's an interesting input here, that very often these books by people who are essentially journalists, observers, reporting on China, give you some very interesting insights into daily life, or some cultural quirks, or some turn of the phrase here, and they give you some additional kind of information. But that doesn't detract us from the fact that it is scholars that should be our main focus. Now I'm just going to ask you all in 1 minute to respond, and then respond in a much lengthier fashion outside here, just as wrapping up.
Since nobody posed any question to me, so I would just say that China's environmental diplomacy has gone through a lot of transition from, highlighting the century of humiliation to proposing the construction of global ecological civilization and community of shared future for the mankind. So I think it would be interesting if anybody of you who wants to work on China's climate change policies or diplomacy, or how China has been at the international climate change negotiations, these, transition is an interesting thing which you can work on. Thank you.
Comparison of India and China, of late I haven't seen much, sir, but in around 2007 there was an edited volume, and some of the people who contributed to that volume dealt with this whole India-China comparison story. In fact, the book was built around, the edited volume was built around this India-China comparison, and the fundamental submission was that it's very easy to look at India and China in terms of binaries, which we should be avoiding. Everything that's good in in China is not because of their authoritarian system. Similarly, everything that is faulty in India is also not because of the democratic system. So therefore, the idea is to go into how policy making is done beyond these two binaries and see how India can learn from China. As far as that book by Lan Xiaohan is concerned, Futan University professor, his book is actually a collection of his talks, as part of various courses he has done on Chinese economy. So he doesn't have a thread which he views around the whole book. Innovation in the Chinese context, it's very difficult, because you have political innovation, you have technological innovation, you have economic innovation also. Maybe I conveyed wrongly. When I said make hay when the sun is shining, it is from the state-owned enterprise firms and the private firms who are perhaps skeptical that whether the same policies are going to continue or not. So therefore, they tend to produce more than what is required at a certain point of time. And that's the rationale that the author has advanced there. Now, talking of corruption, we all know that how the local state guidance funds, which have come in place, and how the local leadership, in order to impress the powers to be as part of the nomenclatura system, wanted to go on a rampage when it comes to development, in their particular arena. And they were very much hand in glove with the firms, both SOEs and the private players. So grabbing of land and all that has happened. And now, the real anticipating, how the central government will come to the rescue, because it has done that in previous occasions as far as the real estate collapses have happened. But this time, according to anticipation, the Chinese government, the central government, has not come to the rescue of the real estate, and it has done a U-turn by completely focusing away from real estate-led development to investing more on Chinese science and tech and self-reliance. As far as overcapacity is concerned, we can also say that, this whole middle class, lower middle class aspirations, something which has failed perhaps because of different reasons, but the fact that real estate has led the Chinese consumers down big time, that has not helped the case. And traditionally, the Chinese being more oriented towards saving than, consumption. For a brief period of time, perhaps that happened, but for a very long period of time, it has been a Chinese problem that how do they boost domestic demand? So on that front, they are found to be wanting for sure. Very brief remarks. I just tangentially touched upon some of the things that you have brought about, very important questions. I'm not sure whether I've been able to respond well, but spur of the moment, this is what I would, respond to.
Yeah, sir, thank you for your question. With regard to exceptionalism, indeed, you're right, sir. Actually, my take on Chinese exceptionalism, the book that the author was really discussing about, is he really tries to pass between what the American exceptionalism was about and what the Chinese about. So he brings in as culture as an important category to really interpret exceptionalism, the Chinese exceptionalism here. And at the same time, also some of the age-old institutions, when he say culture, he really, under Xi Jinping, because this book was published in 2021, so you could see Xi Jinping's, culture, and also going to the Confucius ideas, the legalist, tradition. So this brings in what, China is exceptional. That doesn't mean that China goes and, becomes the policeman of the world. In fact, it doesn't want to. It definitely wants to, propagate its interest, but necessarily not military, as the author says that, which I find quite unique in his interpretation of exceptional. But yeah, that would be my take on that. And coming to the land question, like in the Chinese case, if, as a student of China studies and political science, the land doesn't own, the private people don't own land. So when you talk about how the relationship between the land and citizenry, it becomes a very important, because in China, the state actually leases the land to citizens. So therefore, it's for 50 years. If it's for school and universities, it can be only for 40. It can be for SOEs or factories. It can be to, again, 50 years like that. And in minority provinces and all, you have certain land rights. Now, cooperative and the village committees own the land. So the committees have the land, rights of ownership of the land, but they cannot sell it to others. So that structure really shapes the orientation of the political economy at the level also. Yeah.
Thank you so much. On the question of innovation, I think I'd just like to clarify that, not clarify per se, but reiterate that I think in the Chinese context, what I'd prefer to use specifically is the term process innovation, because if we look at innovation in the linear format, where we consider the idea that there's a Silicon Valley and there's an R&D lab, and there's a brilliant idea that's come out which a bunch of venture capitalists are going to fund the application for, I don't think we'll find the exact same ecosystem in the Chinese context, but they'll be innovative with processes, which is precisely why we come to the menial seeming conclusion that there's nothing innovative about them exporting and the world importing. There's a reason that they dominate that game. It's because they found innovative ways to subsidize production, to bring state-owned enterprises into the game, and essentially take away from a level playing field, which has worked wonders for them. If we look at the solar energy supply chain of the 4 or 5 pillars that it will have, going from wafer production to export, they'll have 70 to 90% dominance in each of those pillars, and that's because they've found innovative ways to circumvent international regulations surrounding use of coal, in addition to subsidizing production. So that's the process innovation that leads to dominance, export and import globally. And on military innovation, I completely agree with you. So I think it is indeed true that China has not been to war, and war has taken generic applications like maybe something like GPT in today's context, or something like electricity in the 1890s, and transformed it to produce disruptive power in war. So in the Chinese context, we again see that that's the focus today, on how to take generic generative applications and apply them militarily. And again, we wouldn't know the results, but even here, even in military innovation, we see processes playing out. So when we talk about the disbandment of the strategic support force, of course, there's been a lot of theories surrounding it, right? There's the commander general was corrupt, and there were fault lines between the leadership and Xi Jinping. But I genuinely also think that there's a very plausible explanation that the innovative value of the SSF as an institution ran its course, and there was time to build on it to do something better with it, and which is why we see these specific institutions for information warfare, cyber warfare, and space warfare. So I think in that sense, the Chinese do indeed have the capability to innovate. It just wouldn't be perhaps conventional.
Okay, thanks. I think now we are really standing between them and lunch, but Venkat wants
just
one thing.
Those who are interested in having a peep into the tech ecosystem in China and US, Kai-Fu Lee's AI Superpowers, is a good introductory book for them.
Okay. So, just wrapping up now, Professor Pallad, I think we come back to basic question of how do we define the terms we use. Innovation is, as you said, bandied about in terms of, just exceeding other people's capacities, and therefore, but the point at which you move from a quantitative to a qualitative level is where innovation occurs, and I guess that is where, and therefore, the significance of actually understanding this whole tech war and the battleground that is being projected. I agree completely that the Americans are still the leaders in the field. And there is no way that the Chinese can really reach those levels of innovation. So where exactly is the China challenge going to come in this particular regard? But you raised a lot of questions, and I think briefly to the point you made about India-China comparative studies, I think that's the need of the hour. And while the Washington consensus and Beijing consensus is one part of the story, I think the other side is really the India model and the China model. One book which I read, which had really gone into, but that was way back, I think it appeared sometime in the late 80s, 1980s, comparing India and China's industrial strategies of development. That was Edward Steinfeld or something like that. After that, a detailed micro study of comparative strategies is not seen much. Professor Deshpande and I had co-authored a book which was 50 Years of India-China, where we did a very interesting exercise, which is we brought one Indian scholar, two Indian scholars, basically, not Chinese, one specializing on China, one specializing on India. And they both then examined whether it was industry, economy, human development, foreign policy, and try to compare different strategies in different fields with two people co-authoring one piece. But comparative on India and China are emerging hugely. But the way in which you have raised the point in terms of comparing the two systems, and the private and the public and the state and the market, and how both countries have actually navigated those I think may be the need of the hour. I would agree there completely. But it has been a very interesting session, and I guess validates our decision to include a session like this, because some of the more interesting debates actually happen on books. You move away from the field of books and you move into more institutional articles or opinion pieces. You can have very interesting kind of discussions. But I think those debates which open up, take you deeper into the areas we need to really study, come from the books. And so that has been our humble attempt to kindle the desire to read books, go back to examining the discourse in the true sense of the term, where and how it is originating. So I hope that has been equally beneficial to you all. Thank you all very much. This has been a very interesting session.
Thank you, panel, for such an insightful session. Now I request the chair, Professor Alka Acharya, to present a token of appreciation to the panelist, Dr. Bhim B. Subba, Ms. Shagufta Yasmin, and Ms. Anushka Saxena. I also request the panel to please stand together for a photograph.